What's up, everyone? It's the 12th of June, 2025. My name is Derek, author webmaster of Gematrinator.com, and today we're going to be discussing the numerical synchronicities surrounding the passing of Beach Boys founder Brian Wilson, the eldest of the three Wilson brothers in the band, and also the last of the three to pass away. Brian Wilson dead at the age of 82, and tributes are pouring in from all over the world, and rightfully so. Brian Wilson, essentially the mastermind behind one of the greatest sounds, one of the best pop groups of the 1960s. Of course, that might be a little short-sighted, as the other band members were also strong creative forces in this group. But Brian Wilson was always identified, particularly by the media, as the genius behind the sound. And today, we will take a look at the numerology and talk about how this is synced to another major news story from December of last year, where the CEO of United Healthcare was gunned down. And we'll see the undeniable connections to this in a little bit. And then we'll dive into the numbers to see just how truly coincidental this all is. Now, there was a lot of talk about the date June 11th this year in the quote-unquote truth community. It was a date that even I poked at a few times that I found very interesting, but I don't promote any fear when it comes to this kind of thing. You know, I've done it before where I've picked up on patterns with a future date, and nothing major happened. However, it's true that there is typically a related story to that riddle on that date. And I believe that's what this is, the death of Brian Wilson. A lot of the June 11th stuff had a lot to do with Elvis Presley, who was, of course, one of the biggest figures in all of music back in the 1950s, an era that preceded Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. Now, with the name Brian Wilson, I started poking around at the dates of the Wilson family and noticed that December 4th is the birthday of Dennis Wilson, the middle of the three Wilson brothers, and the first to have passed away, dead at the age of 39 after reportedly drowning. Well, this date, December 4th, was also the date that a man named Brian Thompson was gunned down in New York City, not too far from the World Trade Center. And consider the similarities with the name Brian Thompson and Brian Wilson, both Brians, both son in their name. And not only did this occur on December 4th, but the man who reportedly assassinated the CEO was born on the 6th day of the month in the year 1998. Well, also on the 6th day of the month in the year 1998, this was the death of the other Wilson brother, Carl Wilson, the youngest of the three. So I started putting this together and realized that the death of Brian Wilson is indeed some kind of cosmic mystical synchronicity with the shooting of Brian Thompson. Or maybe these news stories are all staged and arranged by the numbers. We start by looking at, again, the date December 4th from last year. This would have been Dennis Wilson's 80th birthday. In the standard alphabetic order, where every letter is assigned a number 1 through 26 relative to its position in the alphabet, notice how Beach Boys sums to 80. Whereas the founding member of the Beach Boys, Brian Douglas Wilson, using the Pythagorean or reduction form of Gematria, his full name also sums to 80. Notice how the name of the killer, Luigi Mangione, has the same numbers we find in Brian Wilson's name, 136 and 215. Well, the name Brian Wilson gives us a 136, whereas his full name gives us the 215 in the alphabetic order. Now, there's more connections with these guys that we'll review in a little bit. But I first want to explain exactly how these are connected. And it's all through the number 271, which happens to be the reverse ordinal value of Wilson's full name. The CEO who was killed was named Brian Robert Thompson. And his name also shares this 271. Well, the two men died a span of 27 weeks and 1 day apart from one another. This matches the Brown lunation number for the birth of Dennis Wilson, again, whose birthday Thompson was killed on, born during lunation 271, matching both of their names. When the Beach Boys released their first ever studio album named Surfin' Safari back in the year 1962, Brian Wilson was 271 sidereal months old. And understand, we'll look at counts of the moon several times throughout this video. A sidereal month measures a lunar orbit in relation to the stars. So he had his 271st sidereal month right before that album came out. Well, from the date of that album to his death was 3,271 weeks. The CEO, Brian Thompson, died 22,710 days after the release of that album. His assassin, Luigi Mangione, is currently 27 years and 1 month of age. So this is all interesting, but what is it all pointing to? Now, as I mentioned earlier, Brian Thompson was gunned down in New York City. And just like I explained in my video, which is linked down below in the description, it's all synced up to the destruction of the Twin Towers in 2001. The World Trade Center first opened its doors officially on April 4th, which is the date leaving 271 days on the calendar. Now, 271 is a special prime number, the 58th prime. The Beach Boys equals 58 in reverse reduction. In multiple ciphers, including the special Latin method of Gematria, which we'll look at a lot in a little bit, what I think is actually the most significant method, CEO equals 58 there and in reverse. Twin Towers equals 58. And of course, the destruction of the Twin Towers was a recreation of the destruction of the two temples, Solomon's Temple and Second Temple, also known as Herod's Temple, which is all 58. Third Temple and Jerusalem, also 58 in Gematria. And if you measure from the opening of the World Trade Center, that April 4th date, remember, associated with the number 271, Brian Wilson died a span of 19,062 days later. And this reflects the year that the Beach Boys first burst onto the scene, 1962. But there's more very strong connections with his brother Dennis, who had that December 4th birthday. When Dennis Wilson reportedly drowned in 1983, it was exactly 560 weeks after the Twin Towers first opened. 560 is the Latin value of the name Brian Thompson. The Beach Boys' final CD, called That's Why God Made the Radio. This was the final of their 29 studio records. That came out exactly 560 weeks after the September 11th attacks, which Dennis Wilson would have been 56 years old for. Brian Thompson, who has this 56, had the 56th prime number in his age when he died, 263. And if you saw my video or my post on Brian Thompson, 56 was one of the main numbers of focus, all connected to the hotel he was shot at. 2001: A Space Odyssey, which featured the Hilton Hotel where he died. So again, that's in the description if you want to see more. So we mentioned this last album that the Beach Boys recorded and released in June of 2012. And this record is so synced to the death of Brian Wilson, which you'll see more on in a little bit. The album's release date was exactly 1,484 weeks after the death of Dennis Wilson, which stood out immediately to me because the World Trade Center stood for exactly 1,484 weeks. And this is probably the number that connects it all to Elvis Presley, who has all sorts of numbers connected to the Twin Towers as well. Remember, Elvis, a twin at birth, but his brother died. And then you get the shooting of this guy named Brian Thompson, and the name Thompson means twin. So let's explain how this all connects to the 9/11 code. Now, I put most of this post together before we saw news today, June 12th, that there was a major plane crash suffered by the Air India airliner. This was the first, I think it was the first fatal crash, especially a major one, of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. And I tell you what, if you look at the scenes of the crash, that's a lot of things don't really make sense. That's not what this video is about. I'm not going to dissect the crash here, but look up the news for yourself. A very strange landing that had elements that reminded me a lot of the 9/11 attacks. Not suggesting it was terrorism or anything, but again, truth is stranger than fiction, especially when it comes to the media. So the fact that we got this major plane crash just one day after the death of Brian Wilson, I believe, is absolutely no coincidence. And it all ties back to Donald Trump, who, by the way, will be having another one of his mercurial birthdays coming up soon. If not even today. Yeah, it looks like it's coming up tomorrow. The anniversary of the orbit of Mercury since Trump's birth is tomorrow. And it's like we always get a big plane crash when Trump has a mercurial birthday. Remember the crash into a Buffalo Bills player's house on the date he turned 326 mercurial years, for one example. And then in his last mercurial birthday, he was kicking the immigrants out on an airplane, right? That was on St. Patrick's Day. So that was another Trump mercurial birthday. But what really stands out about his age on the date Brian Wilson died is that he was exactly 1,056 sidereal months old. And the number 156 is heavily connected to 9/11. The number 911 is the 156th prime number, whereas 156 is the 119th composite number. Digits obviously connected to the date 9/11. And the name Donald equals 119, whereas Donald J. Trump is just one off of 1190. Furthermore, Donald J. Trump sums to 1056 in Sumerian Gematria. This where the alphabetic order is multiplied by 6. So this matches exactly his lunar age. On top of all this, when you flip the number 119 upside down, you get the number 611. And Brian Wilson dies on June 11th, 6/11. Notice how the number 119 was in Brian Wilson's age twice for the assassination of Brian Thompson, both in the number of days and the number of lunar phases. And this makes sense, because again, this number upside down is 611. And 611 is the Latin value of the word assassination. You may recall that last year, the assassination that was a nice mixture. The assassination attempt on Trump took place at 6:11 p.m. In fact, the date of that shooting was 116 days before the date 11/6. And that was the date that he was announced the winner of the election. Well, if you look at how old Brian Thompson would have been on 6/11, we find out he would have turned 611 months old one day before the death of Brian Wilson. And you even have the extra one to match the digits of the 9/11 attacks, 9/11/01. But what also stands out about this is that Brian Thompson would have been 18,600 days old. Well, the 186th prime number is 1109. And in Latin Gematria, the name Wilson equals 1109. The same digits in September 11th. Think about the date that's written 1109 here in the United States, November 9th, and how that has 1109 Gematria. Brian Wilson was 1109 sidereal months old when he died. His death was also during the 1109th week since the release of the Beach Boys' debut record. The Beach Boys' final studio record came out during Brown Lunation 1106 to match the date, the 11th of June. That album came out 119 days before the anniversary of their debut record. Don't forget the assassin of Brian Thompson, Luigi Nicholas Mangione, has the 116. The name Brian Wilson, also 161. But of course there's more. Now, the only two albums I've mentioned to this point were the first and last records that were released by the Beach Boys. But it's also important to understand that they had one of the most critically acclaimed records of all time with the 1966 album Pet Sounds. And it seems like this date, May 16th of 66, was pretty important as well. Notice how the name of the record, Pet Sounds, sums to 1019 and 110 in reverse gematria. Of course, the Twin Towers down on the 11th of September, 110 stories tall. This album was released 2,977 days before Brian Thompson was born. And 2977 is the number of victims in the September 11th attacks. That album came out 116 weeks and 1 day before construction started. It was also exactly 1,119 weeks after the birth of Dennis Wilson. Now, in the year 2014, the World Trade Center was officially replaced when One World Trade Center first opened its doors to business. And that happened on November 3rd of 2014. On that date, Dennis Wilson would have been 69 years and 11 months of age exactly. And then 1 day later was 6,116 days after the death of his brother Carl. Remember, Carl Wilson died in the year 98, just like Luigi Mangione was born in the same year 3 months later? There's 89 days between those two dates. And then Brian Wilson died 9,898 days later. And 98 is the Gematria his name shares in reduction with Brian Robert Thompson. Wilson's age at death also reflects numbers important to the World Trade Center: 30,307 days. The 337 World Trade Center in New York City both have this. And of course, that's the 68th prime number. World Trade Center construction started on 6/8 of 68. Brian Wilson dead 68 days after the Trade Center's opening date. All connected to the killing of a CEO, which equals 68. So as always, there's more on the blog. And it's not just these stories in the video that I decode, but you'll also find a lot more posts than what I make videos for, especially lately. And this is probably how it's going to be going forward. Did a couple of posts yesterday on the school shooting at a school in Austria. So if you want to check out the numerology for that, of course, this is a topic I cannot do a video on YouTube or I'll get censored again. Aaron Rodgers signing for the Steelers. The final of the French Open. So many things decoded lately, so check that out if you haven't. Blog link down below in the description. So let's wrap up this decode on Brian Wilson, who died at the age of 82. And with the talk of the number 80 that I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to mention that the new World Trade Center, 1WTC, as it's often referred to, sums to both 80 and 82. And if you look at the end of the Beach Boys' recording career, it was 881 days before one World Trade opened. And that's the standard value of Beach Boys, 881. Earlier, I pointed out how Luigi Mangione sums to 136, which matches Brian Wilson in ordinal. Well, Brian Thompson was born 1 year, 3 months, and 6 days after the Twin Towers were inaugurated. The second World Trade Center opened during Brown Lunation 1136, and that date was 136 days after the birthday of Brian Wilson, who again has that number. Well, notice how Brian Wilson died 13 years and 6 days after the last Beach Boys album was released. This same duration of time is also exactly 161 moons, or lunar phases. And in the reverse order, Brian Wilson has the 161. So perhaps you could say this is the start of the 162nd lunation since that album was dropped. Well, the name of that album, Beach Boys, That's Why God Made the Radio, sums to 162 in single and reverse reduction. And it's all aligned with the death of Brian Wilson on the 162nd day of the year. 11th of June and June 11 both have the 162 in Gematria, just highlighting how significant of a date this is on the calendar. But a consecutive number also popped out to me, 163, as this is the reverse value of Beach Boys, 163. Notice how Brian Thompson was born 10,063 days after the last of the Beach Boys. The three Wilson brothers died 2,163 weeks apart exactly. That middle Beach Boy had the 163 in his age for Pet Sounds, but more important is that Brian Wilson was 21,633 days old for 9/11. 163, another prime number, the 38th, connected to death and murder. The name Wilson also equals 38. And the Wilson brothers first hit store shelves 3,838 days before the trade towers were open. And then Brian Wilson dies 3,874 days after one World Trade Center opened. If I'm not mistaken, there's also a 74 when measuring to the 9/11 attacks, 8,674 days. But 3874 is also the gematria of the word killing. And the World Trade Center complex stands just blocks away from the 74th meridian. And that's where Brian Thompson was killed. His name equals 74 and 740. And Brian Thompson was even born in the year 74. Of course, that's a big number to the Jesus code. Jesus is 74 and 11, like the shape of the Twin Towers. The number 166 popped up in a lot of these measurements as well, like how the Twin Towers opened 1,606 weeks after Brian Wilson was born, matching its ordinal value 166. His brothers were born 106 weeks and 6 days apart. And when Dennis died, he had the 166 in his age both in weeks and in days. And then Brian dies 166 days after the anniversary of Dennis's passing. These three brothers are all aligned with the number 224 when you measure between their birthdays. In the ancient Hebrew language, the 224th prime number is the gematria of the first temple. And I did a video on this at the beginning of 2024. There was a plane crash at Haneda Airport in Japan. And you'll notice I put Solomon's Temple on the thumbnail for this video. And that's because think about how the year 2024 was bookended with plane crashes. We had this one in Japan. And then at the very end of the year, we had one in Korea, which essentially borders Japan, on December 29th, the same day that Jimmy Carter died. So a plane crash at the start of the year to honor this president, and then a plane crash at the end of the year to honor the president who died on the same day. That was Jeju Air, Flight 2216, which was December 29th of last year. The same date Jimmy Carter passed away. So there's definitely something with this 224 connected to Solomon's Temple. But to wrap this up, I want to talk about the number 666. Don't we all love this one? Now, what I kind of noticed today is that the number 666 has gematria connected to September 11th, which kind of makes sense. And here you get the digits 122 and 126 that they connect with. Well, when one World Trade Center opened in 2014, it was 126 weeks after the Beach Boys' last album, and 10 years, 220 days before the death of Brian Wilson. Now, this 126 is also shared with his brother Carl Wilson, whose name sums to 126 in ordinal. But this reverse value also stands out. Carl Wilson summing to 144, and this is why. Carl Wilson died 14 years and 40 days after his brother Dennis. And their last album was released 14 years and 4 months exactly after Carl died. Brian's death was 14 months and 4 days after the eclipse last year over the United States. But back to this last record, right? Beach Boys, That's Why God Made the Radio. When you spell this out, notice how it has gematria of 144. And it connects to Carl Wilson through the number 144, just like his name, who already had that connection to his brother. Now, what really cements this is that in Sumerian, this same phrase equals 1998. And again, Carl Wilson, dead in the year 1998, the same year that Luigi Mangione was born. And had Carl lived to see the 9/11 attacks, he would have been 19,988 days of age. But there's one more sync with the number 144. Because Dennis Wilson would have been 80 years and 27 weeks old exactly for Brian's death. And 827 is the 144th prime number. Now, a lot of you probably know that the number 144 is one that's very important to the book of Revelation, where 144 is mentioned on 4 different occasions. And this is the same book of the Bible that reveals 666 as the number of the beast, a number which has a Latin value of 144. Well, Brian Wilson died exactly 174 sidereal months after the final Beach Boys album was released. And 174 is the value of number of the beast in multiple ciphers. 666 also gives us the 2038. Brian's brother Dennis was 2038 weeks old when he died. Also some connections to the number 33, but I'll spare you those for now. Again, as always, all the work is linked down below in the description. So, thanks again for tuning in. Again, I know the channel's been a little bit dry lately, so YouTube doesn't probably do much with my videos. Plus, I get why I don't get as many views. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm repeating myself over and over, explaining how so many of these things are connected to one another. And really, it's the same numbers so often, isn't it? Especially when it comes to this 911-666 code. Now, to me, the repetitiveness of this is what proves the relevance of the code. But it doesn't make for the most exciting content, does it? So, I'm glad Gematria isn't dying on YouTube. It's just being spread out differently. And I think that's good for everybody. Because it shouldn't just be my perspective that people get when they see these things. There's larger synchronicities at play that are all panning out by a much deeper mystic symbolism than what I'm capable of unraveling here on my silly streaming YouTube channel. However, I do think there's relevance, again, due to the consistency of how I present my work. We're just taking a handful of dates. Really, I mean, I can probably show you how every one of these dates in the grid was mentioned, or every one of these measurements at some point throughout this video. And some that I skipped over as well. But this seems to be how it works. I mean, no matter how old you get, you end up dying by this code. And that's why I have a strong belief that we live in some sort of mathematically constructed system where symbolism and language seems to be scripting our reality more so than the randomness of the stars and things of the sort. So that'll do it for my rambling and this edition of Obsessive Numerology. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. R.I.P. to Brian Wilson. Again, the Beach Boys, truly one of the best bands of the era, bringing an emotional feel to pop music that I think a lot of people related to at different points of their lives. And I'll always have an appreciation for what these guys did. So R.I.P. Brian Wilson and the rest of the Wilson brothers. And I guess Brian Thompson, too, if you're a big fan of the healthcare companies. Peace, love, God bless. We'll talk to you all next time. See ya.